my name's Rachel Mitch, and I'm a British Academy grant holder as part of their Tackling the UK's International Challenges research scheme. Today, I'm going to teach you how to bake something called a raised beefsteak pie from a recipe from 1795. Pies have been a part of European diets for many centuries, and they've been eaten by all sorts of people. In our project, we're looking specifically at what George III and his family ate, and we know that he ate this kind of pie, but we also know that lots of other kinds of people in Britain could eat them. So it was an elite, but also a commonplace food. In order to make your pie, you're going to have to gather some ingredients, and some of those ingredients are the exotic spices that were becoming increasingly popular in British kitchens in the 18th century. So things like salt and pepper, of course, but also things like cinnamon and nutmeg, which I'm using today. These created beautiful aromas in the kitchen, I'm sure you'll agree. And there are a lot of things that we still use today. So here are all the ingredients you'll need for your pie. For the crust, you'll need 575 grams of flour. I've measured my flour out here. You'll need 358 mils of water, and I've got my water boiling away in a saucepan ready for when I make the crust in a few minutes. You'll also need 54 grams of butter and 54 grams of suet. If you don't want to use suet, that's fine. Replacing the suet with an equivalent amount of butter will work perfectly. I'm using an old Hannah Glass recipe from the 18th century, and that's why I've got the combination of butter and suet for my crust. For the filling, you'll need a kilogram of tender fat beef, thinly sliced. And for this recipe, I'm using brisket because I discussed my plans with my local butcher, and that was the advice he gave me. You're going to need salt, and you're going to need a mix of spices. Now, because the recipe didn't specify which spices to use, I looked into my cupboards and tried to find things that I know King George III had in his cupboard. So I'm using pepper, and I'm using cinnamon, and I'm using nutmeg. Okay, you're going to need some thick gravy, half a pint to be precise, and I've got mine here ready measured out in my gravy boat. And you'll need a spoonful of vinegar, and I'm going to be using white wine vinegar today in my pie. Okay, in terms of equipment, you don't need much. I've got a rolling pin here, and you'll see that I'm going to use it to tenderize the meat, but also to roll out the pastry crust in a few minutes. I've got a wooden spoon. I'm not going to be using a mixer today. I'm going to be using this wooden spoon because that's a much more authentic 18th century kitchen tool. And you're going to need a cake, dish, or pie tin for baking your pie in. And I've chosen this one because looking through images from some of the cookbooks I have from the 18th and 19th century, it looks like what they would have used is something with a sort of opening mechanism like this. Mine is non-stick, but I put some butter in just to be safe, so you might want to do that too. Okay, so that's all I need. And once you've gathered your ingredients, you can start making your pie. And the first thing is to get the meat ready and have measured out all the spices like we've already done. The important thing is to get the meat ready before you make the crust, because when you've got the crust ready, you're not going to want it to dry out. You're going to want it to be nice and fresh when you're rolling it out and have the meat ready to go. Okay, so here we go. I'm tenderizing the meat like this. I've done all the other pieces before. I got my husband to help me with it. So I should do a shout out and thank you for that. You're going to season the meat with some salt, some pepper, a little bit of nutmeg, which I'm going to grate on like this. Oops. Some cinnamon. Very classic 18th century flavorings here. So hopefully this will give you a nice little taste of history. Okay, so here we go. And then you pair the two pieces together after you've tenderized them and seasoned them. And you roll them up. And now they're ready to go. Okay, now it's a good time to make the crust. To make the crust, I've brought my water to the boil here, and I'm adding in the suet, which I showed you before, as well as the butter which I also had measured out and showed you before. And I'm going to mix these in with the water to make it lovely and greasy. And that's going to be what helps to make the crust. So I'm just going to stir this for a moment, as you would do if you were making this at home. And the butter and the suet melt into the water really, really quickly once you start to stir them in, and then you mix them into your crust. Now, I've made this recipe before, and it was a little bit of a trick to adapt it because Hannah Glass's original recipe calls for a peck of flour, which turns out to be somewhere between 12 and 14 pounds. Now, I never want to make that much pie crust, but I certainly didn't have access to that much flour during the current lockdown. So my husband and I did some math. We used some 19th century recipes and also some 21st century recipes through the BBC online. And we figured out what the proportions would amount to, and that's how we came up with the formula that we're using today. So part of historical cookery is the fun of the detective work of figuring out, well, what worked then, what works now, what do I have in my kitchen, what am I able to do, and how can I adapt it? So don't be afraid to experiment and adapt. Historical cooking is about getting a flavor of the past. It's not about trying to be super authentic and recreating everything. And once your water is nice and greasy, full of melted butter and suet, you can start pouring it into the flour. And you're going to mix it in bit by bit. And remember I said that I'm not using a mixer today because I'm trying to be a little bit 18th century here. But like I just said, authenticity is not the only purpose of this exercise. It's also meant to be fun and interesting and flavorful. So if you think that what you'd like to do is bung out your mixer and do a pie crust the way you normally would, I think that's a perfect idea. So go for that. Okay, we're going to mix up the crust and then we'll move on to the next step in a minute. Once your pie crust is ready, it'll look like this. I've taken off about 2/3 of the pastry and put it aside wrapped up in cling film so it doesn't dry out because I'm going to need to make a lid for my pie once I've filled it. I'm going to roll out the crust now so that I can fit it in to the pie dish. I really enjoy the rolling. There's something so satisfying about doing this, and I think it feels like a nice old-fashioned activity that we can do that can kind of give us a feeling of being in touch with some of these old recipes, old ways of doing things by hand. I think one of the things that we're learning during lockdown, for some of us anyway, is the kind of the joy of going back to doing things by hand because we're not eating out so much and we're at home a bit. I know that that hasn't been everyone's experience, but I am trying to use this time to get in touch with some of the food and recipes that I've been cooking. Now, I just want to show you what's going on in this tin. What I did, I don't know if you noticed, is that I didn't roll the pastry out super thin on the table because it would have been hard then to lift it into the tin. And instead, what I'm doing is I'm using my hands, and it's a wonderful tactile experience here because this pastry is still really warm from when I added the boiling water to it and mixed it up. And now I'm using my hands to get it into the right shape. I've done this a few times before, and my mistake early on was being afraid to break it, and so it came out really thick, my crust. So my tip here is don't be afraid to really thin it out, especially here in the corners. Get it nice and thin, because you'll enjoy eating it a lot more if you don't have really thick doughy bits at the edges. What you want is thin crust all over. Mind you, when I was reading my 1861 copy of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, she gives loads of recipes for different kinds of pie crusts. But you know what she says? She says, don't worry which crust you use the cheapest one, because hardly anyone eats it anyway. Because, you know, the pie crust does serve the purpose of keeping the meat really tender and lovely inside. And if you don't like the crust at the end, it's absolutely fine. You can just eat the filling and get rid of the crust and be like Mrs. Beeton and her readers. Okay, so I've thinned it out, I've flattened it out, I've given it the shape of the dish. And now I'm going to start to fill it with my rolls of beef, which I made before. Now, my recipe called for some chopped up pickles to be added after you've put in the beef. Now, that was a perplexing thing to me. I talked with some colleagues who I'm working with on this project. We speculated about what kinds of pickles they might be and what I might put in. We talked about pickled gherkins as something that would be a bit of a Germanic flavor that the king and his wife might enjoy. But I don't know, and I didn't really have anything in the house that could serve that purpose. So I'm skipping that part of the recipe, and I don't feel bad doing it because, in fact, all the other beefsteak pies I looked at didn't call for pickles. So I'm adapting, and I think that's something that you can do too. You can adapt to what you have at home, but look how lovely this looks once you've put the steak in. This is a really beautiful amount of meat, very beautifully arranged inside of this crust. And now I'm going to add my half a pint of very thick gravy because the recipe says use very thick gravy thickened with extra flour and butter, and that's what I've done here. So it's a lovely, thick, luxurious gravy. Don't worry, you can cheat. You can use store-bought gravy if you want. There's absolutely no problem with doing that. The point is to make something you're going to enjoy eating. It isn't all about doing it at home. Nothing wrong with getting some pre-made gravy from your local supermarket. And the final ingredient here is a spoonful of vinegar. And I'm using white wine vinegar. All it said was vinegar, so I had to guess. And again, use what you've got, use what you like. Use balsamic if you want, that couldn't be too bad. Quite a fashionable flavour now, but not one that George III had available to him. One of the tricky things about the 18th century recipes, but what also makes it quite fun to work with them, is the fact that they don't really tell you a lot about amounts. So they say a spoonful. We would expect to be told which size of spoon. So, guesswork, trial and error. These are things that you have to be willing to do if you're going to make an 18th century recipe. But it's also part of the fun, and it's also part of the trial and error, just to try and enjoy the experience a little bit. Keeping this tiny bit of dough here, or pastry I should say, because my recipe says you should make some leaves to decorate your pie lid, and I'm going to see if I have the skills to do that. So I'm rolling out this other third of the pastry that I kept aside before so that I can make a lid. And you're going to want to have a nice tight fitting lid on your pie because you don't want all that lovely gravy oozing out into your oven. I hate cleaning the oven, so obviously oozing of gravy is not going to be a good thing. Now this one I'm trying to get a little bit thinner so that it covers the whole pie because unlike when you're doing the filling and you can use your hands to shape it after it's in, sorry, not the filling, the inside crust, you can use your hands to shape it, but here I've got to make sure that my lid's going to cover the whole tin. So I'm just rolling it out nicely. I'm doing this reasonably quickly while it's all still nice and warm and soft and malleable. It's not breaking up, it's working perfectly. Now I'm going to start to attach it. So very gently here, lifting it up. I've made it the right size so that it can fit round. And then with my fingers, just pinching. Some people are much more delicate and dainty than me at doing these things. I have to say, I'm not a natural pastry chef, probably. My husband does that kind of stuff, beautiful profiteroles, all sorts of things. But for the sake of my research, I'm willing to try anything. And once you pinch all the way around and close it up, and again, I'm not a natural. You don't have to feel like if yours isn't going to look like something at the local pie shop that you shouldn't bother to do it. I think you should bother to do it. You should enjoy it. You should enjoy how rustic it looks. Look how rustic this looks. And the last thing you've got to do, and don't forget, but I've lost my wooden spoon, so I'm going to use this spoon instead, is to make a hole in the middle so that the steam will have a way to escape when this pie is baking in your oven. So there we go. And I'm going to try and make some leaves, and I'm going to pop this in my oven, which I've preheated to 160 degrees, because I'm going to cook this slowly for a reasonably long time. Hi, so my pie was in the oven for a couple of hours, and now I'm going to open the tin and see how it's turned out. Oh, it looks amazing. And the whole house smells of all those rich spices and the meat cooking in the gravy, and I just cannot wait for lunch today. I'm just going to cut a piece and take it out of the pie, and hopefully then I can show you what it looks like inside. There we go. A beefsteak pie fit for a British king. Thank you very much.